Hello again. The Practical Animal channel is dedicated to the public understanding of conservation by showcasing what conservationists do. These are their stories. Today's guest is an expert on wombats. Yolandi Vermaak is founder and director of Wombat Rescue in Canberra, Australia. There are 3 species of wombat in Australia. Yolandi, would you say that you ran a wombat sanctuary?
We're not really a sanctuary in the true sense of the word, because a sanctuary is a big property with large space, open space, where they can have multiple enclosures. We've then remodeled our sort of operations to be decentralized. So wherever there's someone with a little bit of space, we can put an enclosure there. So instead of one person having a sanctuary with 20 animals, we sort of try to have multiple people with 2 animals. So
how many species of wombats are there, please?
So we've got the 3 in Australia, which is northern hairy-nosed, southern hairy-nosed, and the bare-nosed. The conservation status for the northern hairy-nosed is critically endangered because there's only 300 left in the wild. The southern hairy-nosed is endangered, and then the bare-nosed is least concern, which means that there's no conservation plans in place for them.
What threats do they face?
So wombats face quite a significant amount of threats. So there's your threats that's caused by the environment, which we don't have a lot of control over, like flooding. Because when they burrow, it's normally their burrows are on riverbanks, on floodplains. So whenever there's a rain event and it floods, their burrows get flooded and they drown. And then we had the severe bushfires 3 years ago. So whenever there's a bushfire, it really affects them as well. And then there's the man-made or man-implemented sort of challenges that they face. So the most common one, obviously, is car strikes, because we build roads wherever they have their paths. Land clearing is a big one. Australia is quite known for land clearing, rural and urban for development. And then mange is a pretty big, significant introduced parasite that's decimating wombat populations at the moment.
Is the mange affecting the 3 different species?
So the northern hairy-nosed is protected in reserve, so they don't occur wild. You know, they are behind fences and there's rangers looking after them, so they're not affected. The southern hairy-nosed can get mange, but because they're so fragmented, their populations are quite small and they sort of protected. If a population is healthy and a sick animal doesn't come in, they are okay. But because the range for the bare-nosed is still the biggest of the 3 species, mange keeps rolling, infecting population to the next, sort of neighbouring populations.
Are there many conservation projects working on wombats in Australia, Yolandi?
There are wildlife groups who are doing work, I guess, that can be classed as conservation, but there's no conservation efforts from a government perspective because they're not threatened. They're not on the threatened species list. So we've got a threatened species commissioner who looks after all these threatened species, but we are trying to get to prevent wombats, bare-nosed, to go onto the threatened species list. But because there's so many that's already threatened, you know, that's where the money is being funneled to. So unfortunately, there's no formal conservation plans or programs in place. It's just groups like mine who on the ground try to make it a small difference.
So your group is really quite unique.
It is unique, yeah.
Wow, fantastic. Fantastic in an interesting way. I mean, I'm pretty sure it's probably quite stressful. But
yeah.
How do you see wombat conservation changing over the next 10 years, Yolandi?
I think what we've been preaching is sometimes dismissed. When we say numbers are declining, there's pushback saying, no, it's not true. And I think over the next 10 years, what we've been saying and warning is going to become more apparent, because we're going into a drought season soon, again with El Nino. And I think it's just going to become more apparent, because for me personally, having been able to drive certain roads consistently over the last 5 years, I can see the decline in population. I can see that there's less and less and less systematically. And I think over the next 10 to 20 years, we are going to see a massive decline in populations, because mange, it's a death threat for them, basically, because it's not something that they can recover from. And I don't know if people quite understand it, but mange is like scabies in humans. It's a parasite. So you can't have a vaccine against it. And once this parasite gets hold of wombats, because they're so unique in terms of burrowing and being nocturnal, that's the ideal breeding ground for those mites. So they just don't die. And the mite load that mange or wombats carry just means that it takes anything from 6 to 12 months before they die. And in those 6 to 12 months, they spread those mites to other burrows, to other wombats. So we can only treat the ones that we find or that gets reported to us, but there's hundreds and thousands of them out there that don't. So this is definitely going to impact on their population, their numbers significantly.
The mange mite, where did it come from?
The main theory is that it was brought to Australia by settlers 200 years ago. So they must have had livestock and animals like dogs that were infected with mange. I mean, mange is something that you find in every single country on Earth. And although dogs may get mange, it's quite treatable. It's just wombats are nocturnal and underground, so it's really hard to get to them. But it's just taken a really significant foothold on wombats in particular.
Is anybody doing any conservation captive breeding with wombats?
So we're not allowed to breed in captivity. The license prescriptions that we need to adhere to is for rehabilitation and release. So you get an animal once they are mature enough to be released, or when they're not sick anymore, you have to take them back to the wild. So we can't keep them in captivity and breed. If there are breeding programs, it would more center around the northern hairy nose because of their conservation status.
Yolandi, what skills and personal qualities does a person need to do what you do?
That is such a good question. Well, you need to be able to sleep very little. Yeah, look, diplomacy is definitely part of it, because you work with politicians, you work with landowners who are less inclined to help. You work with volunteers, you work with companies, with organizations, you work with donors. So it's important to be able to have that skill to talk to other people. And, you know, the joke always goes with you're either a human person or an animal person. We obviously love animals, but you need to be able to work with humans. I think I've been born to be a rescuer. So you have to have that knack, that skill to be able to work with quite hairy situations. You know, an animal that's been hit by a car is not pretty. Working in that type of scenario can't be too squeamish. You need to be able to just get in there and do stuff and get your hands dirty, so to speak. Passionate, driven.
And you do this on a part-time basis, don't you? When do you get time to sleep?
I don't sleep a lot. I work part-time, and then every other hour that I have available is filled with wombats. So yeah, look, running an organization plus doing the field work is quite challenging, but I do have an amazing team of volunteers who are out there with me, or I can ask them to do a piece of work if I can't do it, to go out and do a rescue or help a wombat that's sick.
How did you get into this, Yolandi?
I'm originally from South Africa, so the animals in Africa are very different to the animals in Australia. So in Africa, you have the big five and lions and cheetahs and things. And when I came to Australia, I went to a zoo and they brought out this little fluffy brown thing and said, "This is a wombat joey." And of course, I got to hold it and I was just smitten. So when you meet something that you really like, you are curious about it and start reading about it. And of course, I've always wanted to be a vet my whole life. So animals, I gravitate towards what is this and how can I have more of this. So I started volunteering, working with wombats, and then you start to get to know the background. Like, there's an issue, there's a problem. These animals all come into care. Why are they coming into care? Because they're orphans. And then, of course, I was introduced to the whole world of mange and the significant issue in animal welfare that poses. And I got involved with that. And that's just taken over my whole life.
So mange was pretty significant from the beginning for you.
Yeah, as soon as I started to learn, because you don't know what you don't know. So there was a point when I knew there's a wombat or a species, but I didn't know that they get mange. And then I started to learn. And then you just start to get deeper and deeper involved into how it affects them, the fact that they die from it, that they can't recover once they've had it, that sort of thing. And it makes you very driven, because every wombat that's sick that gets reported is a race against the clock, right? Because we know that they're going to die. So you don't want to hear that a landowner says, yeah, I know that there's a sick wombat. I saw it 4 months ago. The question is, why did you report it 4 months ago? So there's always this haste to get to the animal as quick as possible, because we know every second that we lose brings them closer to dying.
It strikes me that it takes an awful lot of organisation, this. Do you mind going into a little bit more detail about how it works with having the wombats at different geographic locations, please?
Well, I guess that's where a team of volunteers comes in, because Australia is quite unique in the sense that in the Australian Capital Territory, where I'm residing in Canberra, it's a state within a state. So Canberra is sort of a little pocket world in New South Wales. So we operate mainly in Canberra, but also sort of on the fringes just around it. And because it's the bush capital, right? So we are surrounded by farms and bushland. There's still quite a number of populations left. And obviously we've got 2 main riverways that flows through Canberra. And all along the riverways, you will find wombat. So we get reports from literally 100 kilometers north, east, south, or west from Canberra, whether it's a landowner or it's a cyclist or a jogger or whoever. Someone drives past and sees a wombat in a paddock and they would call us. So all calls come through to me and we log them, and I farm it out to my team, and we decide who's the closest, who can get there the quickest, and go and treat that wombat. And then we have a plan. So usually we try to treat a wombat in the field because we don't have the facilities to bring them all into care. There's just hundreds of them that we treat in a month. But if a wombat is too sick to survive, or it's a baby, then we do bring them into care.
Wow, it's so interesting. How does it work with getting veterinary care for the wombats that need it? Do you have to pay vets, or do they offer their time?
Yeah, so that's a tricky question, because obviously it's a service that vets should be providing for free. I think, and I'm speaking under correction here, but I think that there's legislation around that. I'm not completely up to speed with that. So some vets do provide that for free. Some would charge maybe just for x-rays or for medicine, because it's a cost to them too, right? And they're really busy. They have their standard patients. So it is tricky for them to balance the workload that they've got already, plus the wildlife that comes in. So we've been lobbying. I know other wildlife groups have been lobbying, and we've been supporting that, to have a dedicated wildlife vet in the ACT that can look after the wildlife groups here, like dedicated just wildlife, so we don't have to compete with domestic animals. So for the moment, while we don't have that, I've built a relationship with a couple of vets that are quite keen to expand their knowledge on wildlife. Obviously, not all vets would be wanting to do that for various reasons, but some are just really close to burnout or they're too busy. but there are vets who's really willing to walk the extra mile with us and learn from us as carers. So we do have a lot of knowledge that I'm not a vet, but I do know a lot of things that they can learn from me and I can learn from them, certain procedures, and I've learned how to do injections and all sorts of things. So it's a really good symbiotic relationship between me and the vet.
That's fantastic. Yolandi, somebody watching this, starting to get inspired and interested, what do they need in order to work with wombats? I mean, are there any jobs with wombats as such? Are the only positions voluntary, or are charities like yours looking to expand their efforts to rehabilitate and rescue wombats?
That's a huge question. Look, there's no paid jobs, not just for wombats, but I think for most wildlife, there's just not much out there that would pay. I guess if you look at threatened species, you might find ecologists sometimes that would be paid, that do work for that, but they would work for government. I would love to be paid for what I do, but unfortunately, it's just how it is. We all work as volunteers, not so much to be paid. The first part of your question is both true. So although they need, I believe, a lot of conservation work because they are falling through the cracks. Wombats are seen as least concern in terms of their conservation status, so which means we don't have to worry about them. There's heaps of them. And I don't think that's true. Their numbers have been declining systemically over the last, decades, 2 decades. Mange has been increasing, roads have been increasing, disasters have been increasing, development, land clearing, farms, the clear for paddocks has been increasing. So wombats only have a joey every 2 years. So if you think about the amount of deaths that is caused by all these factors, and they only have a joey every 2 years, it's not sustainable for population growth. So while I think we do need to have conservation projects in place, they are still seen as pests in rural communities. So it's a very much a love-hate relationship. There's us who love them, but they do cause damage on farms. So farmers are just really fed up with damaged fences or a burrow in a paddock. So we offer solutions. So we do have farmers that we work with. There's a solution to just about every problem. But it takes time, and it takes some effort, and it takes some money to invest in a solution. And sometimes people are just not willing to do that.
So in fact, one of the 3 species is critically endangered. They are in need of conservation work. Do you find that attitudes are starting to change and people are perceiving them as a pest less and less?
I see attitudes changing from not knowing to knowing. So our education and raising awareness is bearing fruit. I can see that. But I think the cohort that sees wombats as pests is not necessarily changing. It's not a cohort that I would necessarily work with a lot because it would be your rural landowners that runs big stock farms, for example, who do not want wombats to compete with their livestock. So I wouldn't have a lot of interaction there because they don't want me there. They don't want conservation actions to happen. They don't want mange to be treated. They would just shoot the wombats. That said, I know that there's maybe a small push for rural landowners to become more tolerant of wombats, but it's a very small push. I think we can do more. But in terms of just the general population, I think awareness is definitely being raised.
Yolandi, does a person need a degree to do what you do?
No. No, you just need to have that dedication because it's not an easy job. It brings a lot of trauma and a lot of tears and a lot of stress, sometimes a bit of PTSD. But it also brings immense joy when you raise a tiny 200-gram little thing that's still pink to a 26, 30 kilo big male, and you can release them back into the wild. So it, there's obviously joy and sorrow in everything we do.
What advice can you offer to, say, new volunteers who join the project that are perhaps not expecting the trauma and the PTSD and the emotion that they're going to face?
Look, I think I'm pretty honest with my volunteers when they start that there's a lot of different jobs that we do, and different aspects that we focus on, and you don't have to do it all. So there's volunteers who definitely do not want to do road rescue. They can't deal with a broken animal or blood. So that's not expected of them. They might come on a Sunday morning when we do mange treatment. So when we do mange population treatment, you don't see the wombats. You just walk from burrow to burrow and place medicine in a cup.
Oh.
So it's a beautiful day outside. The river's next to you. It's nice and sunny, and you chat with the other volunteers while you do it, and you go home in 2 hours. So that's a nice job to do. And you're helping the wombats, although you never see them. So every volunteer who starts knows exactly which parts are more traumatic than others, and they decide what they want to get involved in. I do all of it, but I'm not expecting the volunteers to do all of it.
Would you be able to suggest to any ecology student watching this and getting interested in wombats a possible project for them to do?
Look, there's quite a lot of research being done, but I think there's an amazing amount that we don't know about wombats. And I think one of the things that's lacking is a better understanding of wombat behavior. I'm a psychology student, so I'm fascinated by behavior, whether that's human or animal. And I do think behavior predicts a lot of our outcomes. If you understand a wombat's behavior, you'll know how to not release. For example, you can't release a male into a stable population where there's already an alpha male, because they will fight and kill each other. That's a very simple example, but that's a good thing for someone to study, to have a better understanding of their behavior and the ins and outs of wombats, basically to sort of inform conservation efforts, release plans, care plans, rescue plans. You have to understand the species to be able to really, really help them.
Yolandi, where would you say that your passion and commitment come from? Is it the desire to have been a vet?
Yeah, I don't know. My parents were not animal people at all. And I was the oldest of 3. And since I can remember, I think my earliest memory of doing a rescue was probably 5 or 6 years old. So I was forever finding little birds that fell out of nests, and I killed every single one of them with kindness and love. I tried my best. I wanted to raise every single one, and they all died because no one took time to teach me, what do you do? What do you feed a baby bird? I don't know. I'm 6 years old, but I'm trying. So clearly what I fed them didn't work. But I never stopped. It's this innate desire to rescue an animal. So I kept doing that. So I rescued birds and cats and all sorts of animals in South Africa. And then it just naturally translated into rescuing wombats when I came to Australia.
Yolandi, is there anything that you'd like to add?
The one thing that I always say, and this is probably more geared towards people in Australia that are on the roads a lot, is to be kind, because I know half the population hates wombats and half love them. And I think you don't have to like them, but if you do find them, because roadkill is a pretty significant thing in Australia, is you do need to stop. You do need to take the pouch and do a rescue and save that baby, because one of the things that's quite hard for us is to find a mum that's been hit by a car and she had a baby in the pouch and it's frozen to death. So we do a lot of road rescue campaigns and really plead with people to please stop and check the pouch. You see a lot of dead animals and you think, well, she's dead, right? So I don't have to stop. But you don't realize that there's a baby in there. And then the other thing that's really important to me, close to my heart, is the whole mange conversation, is that we are pleading, especially to landowners who are on private properties where we don't have access, is to, if you do have a mangy wombat that they are dying, as soon as they have mange, the clock's ticking. And if you would be willing to allow us, we would be treating them and saving their lives.
Yolandi, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for your time coming onto the Practical Animal channel. Yolandi Vermaak of Wombat Rescue in Australia.
Thank you for having me.